Good afternoon. My name is Haley Paul, and I am Audubon Arizona's Policy Manager. We are glad to have Ted Kowalski from the Walton Family Foundation and Kevin Moran from the Environmental Defense Fund join us on this Western Rivers Action Network webinar. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us. Ted and Kevin were appointed as the non-governmental organization representatives to the Arizona Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Steering Committee back in July. There have been several public and work group meetings so far in hopes of reaching agreement on the conditions that need to be met within Arizona in order to make the drought contingency plan acceptable to the affected parties. Ted and Kevin will present to us today some key concepts such as the recent GRIM hydrology of the Colorado River Basin, what the Lower Basin DCP is intended to do, and updates from the steering committee process. There will be an opportunity to submit your questions and comments related to the DCP in the chat box function, and that is at the bottom of the GoTo training panel. FYI, your phone lines are muted, and they'll stay muted just because we have a lot of people registered for this webinar. However, please submit your questions and comments in that chat box. We're going to collect all those questions and comments, and we probably won't have time to answer all of them in the webinar with the 1 hour limit. However, we will follow up and respond back out to those who are registered for this webinar. So Ted, Kevin, I turn it over to you. And Ted, I assume you were able to hear me, and it's turned over to you now. And let us know when you need us to switch slides.
Thanks, Haley. Yes, this is Ted Kowalski, and I'm the lead on the Colorado River Initiative on behalf of the Walton Family Foundation, where our goal is to ensure a sustainable Colorado River, a healthy Colorado River for the benefit of the environment and the people that depend on a healthy Colorado River. And we work everywhere from the headwaters in Wyoming and Colorado all the way down through the lower basin in Arizona, Nevada, and California, and all the way into Mexico on ensuring healthy, sustainable water management practices. And we're excited to be part of the conversation with the state of Arizona and the Central Arizona Project related to the steering committee, and we're going to get into more details related to that. But first, I'll turn it over to Kevin to describe his role.
And that, Ted, might not be possible because we're still getting Kevin connected, so we can circle back with Kevin when his presentation portion starts. But you can proceed as you need to. We're still getting him connected.
Sure.
Thanks.
Great. And when he joins, I'll let him just give a quick introduction at the appropriate time. Maybe before he starts leading on some of his slides. And then I think, as Haley indicated there, you can submit questions. I saw that there were already a couple of comments and questions submitted, and I'm looking forward to reserving some time at the end of this hour to trying to answer some of those questions or have a little bit of a dialogue as the technology will allow related to specific comments. Next slide. So we have a presentation for you today that's going to focus on the hydrology, the outlook, and the actions. And I'm going to lead off talking a little bit about the hydrology and the current situation that we're in the Colorado River Basin. I think Kevin's going to take a little bit more of the lead on both the outlook and the actions, but we're going to be sort of tag teaming the presentation as we go through, and definitely going to reserve some time for questions and discussion at the end. So next slide. So in terms of hydrology, we're going to get into some of the details, but I think the bottom line is that the Colorado River Basin is in what's viewed by everyone as sort of the worst 18-year drought that for thousands and thousands of years. And from my perspective, it's almost the wrong word to use, the word drought, because the way I see it, when we started this sort of conversation in 2013 and 2014, we were talking about how it was the worst 13-year drought, and then it was the worst 14-year drought, and then the worst 15-year drought. And at some point, we need to change the conversation and maybe use a different word than drought, because the word drought implies that there better times right around the corner, and that we can see full reservoirs start to come because the hydrology will shift. And really what I think what we're experiencing is sort of a new normal. And certainly, some academics recently have termed the phrase or the word aridification, which is basically that we are living in a hotter and drier time period as a result of climate change. And I certainly believe that to be the case, and I think that we need to plan for hotter and drier time periods, and that water managers need to plan for that, because otherwise, certainly it is possible that we could see some wetter hydrology come down the road, but I think we need to be planning for hotter and drier times, because I think that's sort of where we are headed as a water basin. Next slide. And I think it'll become apparent sort of as we look at and talk about sort of the longer time periods with regard to the Colorado River Basin. So this first figure is just demonstrating this past year's hydrology. In the blue line, it's marked current water year 2018. And we really peaked at about 73% of the median on March 30th. So we had an earlier peak than is typical. We had a lower peak than is typical. And you can see that 2017, which was supposedly going to be this banner year that was going to change the sort of future outlook for the Colorado River Basin, actually did produce some additional above average water in terms of snow, but in the flows actually did not pan out all that well. And then you have in the black line the longer 30-year period average, and we were well below average this past year, and you'll see that reflected in a couple of slides, both in the storage and in the flows that we saw. So next slide. So just to orient you here, the Colorado River has many reservoirs or buckets that we refer to as the plumbing of the system. The two main ones, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are the two largest reservoirs in the United States, and they're important reservoirs for management of the Colorado River Basin. Lake Mead is located just outside of Las Vegas, and it is hovered right about elevation 1075, which is an important elevation for Colorado River management. In 2007, the basin states and the federal agency, the Bureau of Reclamation, adopted rules about how we would manage Lake Powell and Lake Mead in a coordinated fashion, as well as rules for when and how shortages would be declared by the Secretary of the Interior and metered out to the lower basin states. Importantly, Arizona and Nevada are the only two states that receive shortages when it is declared by the Secretary, and it's done in a complicated fashion whereby the Secretary of Interior uses the August 24-month study, which is basically a projection for the next 2 years of the hydrology. And if the Secretary of Interior projections demonstrate that January 1st, Lake Mead will be below 1075, then a shortage is declared, and there are certain actions that have to be taken to reduce the amount of water available to Arizona and Nevada. And elevation 1075 is that first Tier 1 declared shortage, and it's hovered right about that number. Importantly, we also have Lake Powell, and you can see that Lake Powell has the equalization level on there, which can allow much higher releases to come from Lake Powell down to Mead. And then the minimum power pool line is elevation 3490, but the Bureau of Reclamation gets nervous when we approach elevation 3525, which would have implications for getting water out of Lake Powell, and there's all sorts of things like cavitation or things that can happen to the infrastructure at Lake Powell that would be negative. And so it's really in both the lower basin and the upper basin's interest to keep those reservoirs above those sort of critical thresholds described there and described further in the upcoming slides. You can go ahead to the next slide. So this shows a little bit longer period of hydrology and storage in those two major reservoirs, Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. And you can see a couple of critical time periods. 1944 is when the U.S. and Mexico entered into a treaty dividing out how water would be shared between our two countries. And then you can see the 1950s drought, as well as when Lake Powell came on in the 1960s, and we started filling Lake Powell under those filling criteria with the Bureau of Reclamation. And then, we had some very wet years in the 1980s. It was documented in a book maybe some of you have read or heard about called The Emerald Mile, where the Bureau of Reclamation was basically trying to keep water from overtopping Lake Powell during that time period. And then, importantly, in 2001, the basin states and the Bureau of Reclamation had adopted surplus criteria. They basically were dividing up how surpluses would be shared among the lower basins states. And immediately following the adoption of those surplus criteria, we saw one of the biggest declines in storage and some of the worst hydrology in the Colorado, reflected in the Colorado River Basin hydrology, and the reservoirs dropped over 130 feet in just a few years. And just noticing that steep decline is possible and has occurred in the last 18-year period is really important and critical to think about as we frame up the context of the current discussions and negotiations related to drought contingency plans or drought contingency planning, which we'll talk about in a moment. Next slide. And you can see this is the 18-year period that I talk about as sort of being the driest 18-year period for literally thousands of years when you look at tree rings analysis. And you can see that there were only a handful or a couple, 3 or 4 different years where we've been above average. And those above average time periods were, last year was really only about 110% above average when you look at that longer term unregulated flow. 2011 was an important wet year as well, and I think we did have equalization releases, which meant that Lake Powell was above that earlier line I pointed out, and it released more than 8.23 million acre feet and more than 9 million acre feet. I think it released closer to 11.5 million acre feet, but really there's been a lot of more years below that unregulated flow average, and some significant, like you can see 2012, 2013, where it was back-to-back years of 45 and 47% of average. 2002 was a 24% of average. You can see that on there, and and then this year sort of is similar in scale of those sort of drier year periods, and that it was about 47% of average of the unregulated inflow. You can go on to the next slide. And then this shows a much longer and broader set of hydrology going all the way back to the 1900s. And many people are aware of this and talk about the fact that the 1922 Compact, which was an agreement that the basin states and the federal government agreed to. It was adopted in the 1920s after a historically wet time period, and we divided up the river in certain ways. In fact, the negotiators of the Colorado River Compact were so confident in the division of the amount of water available for the basins that they actually included a provision within the compact to come back in 50 years and divide up the rest of the excess water that was not divided up under that compact. And of course, the story is, bleaker than that, and that we've seen the actual long-term average is lower than the negotiators divided up in 1922. It's closer to about 15 million acre feet. There's a long-term trend of it declining. And then if you look at the 10-year rolling average, you can see that it's as well been significantly below that 15 over the last 18-year period or so. It's that red line following across, with the yellow line that you see there is what we refer to as a stress test, which is sort of a 1988 to 1915 or 2015 sort of critical time period, which is sort of certainly possible. We've seen that exact hydrology in the last recent history. And so if we were to see that sort of hydrology continue going forward, we could continue to see very difficult decisions need to be made by water managers and water users to how to live within that lower sort of firm yield, if you will. And I think that's probably enough for this slide. Why don't you go on to the next slide, please? And so then this slide shows the historic and future projected Lake Mead end of December elevations. That was the number that I was referring to earlier of elevation 1075, and that's where shortages are declared, and that Arizona and Nevada will receive less water than they are entitled to use when we're under sort of normal hydrology. And importantly, you have the full hydrology, which shows a much rosier picture. Then you have in green, and then you have the median of the full hydrology in that green dotted line going down, and showing that we could definitely see, and in fact, under the existing Bureau of Reclamation numbers, we've seen the likelihood of dropping below 1075 in 2020 is greater than 50%. And importantly, this stress test hydrology shows the likelihood of that even greater than that, and also the possibility and likelihood of Lake Mead dropping below those other critical levels of 1050 and 1025 is pretty significant out through 2026, when the current rules for how we manage the reservoirs expire. And so I think water managers and state leaders and the federal agencies were looking at this and really starting to get nervous and try to figure out, like, okay, what do we need to do to be able to manage through sort of the stress test, this worst possibility of hydrology, in a way that will not completely help us, or in a way that won't allow the reservoirs to drop through those lower levels. Like, we need to still supply water to the city of Phoenix and to the city of Las Vegas, and how do we develop a plan that will allow us to meet those critical water needs if that stress test hydrology continues. And so that's where these conversations around the drought contingency plan sort of developed, is through looking at the past hydrology, looking at the possible future hydrology, and trying to develop a plan that will allow water managers to meet those critical needs. Next slide. So I think this is where I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and hopefully he's on the line, and he can maybe give a quick introduction of his role at EDF.
Thanks very much, Ted. Kevin Moran, Senior Director for EDF's Western Water Program. My role is for the 7 Colorado River Basin states. And right now I'm chairing Water for Arizona Coalition. It's a coalition of 5 environmental NGOs with links to other organizations in the state that is focused on getting a drought contingency plan adopted and making other changes in Arizona water policy and practice to allow Arizona to successfully implement the agreement. Those groups are Arizona Audubon, American Rivers, Western Resource Advocates, Business for Water Stewardship, and Environmental Defense Fund. So with that really excellent foundation of recent information and the state of the river. My part of the presentation is to talk about what are we doing? What is the Water for Arizona Coalition doing to try to affect the situation in Arizona and the region so that we have more sustainable water policy? And that's really the focus of my conversation and recent events in Arizona and the outlook going forward in the near future. Next slide. So this slide lays out the latest Bureau of Reclamation report on the probabilities for a federally declared shortage according to the 2007 interim guidelines. And the most recent report says that there's now a 57% chance that on January 1, 2020, Lake Mead will be below elevation 1075. And that would trigger a mandatory federal shortage in the lower basin. And also that modeling shows that Lake Mead could drop by 200 feet or more by the middle of 2020. So the grim hydrology of this most recent report really points up what we talk about as a new water reality in the region. Almost certainly less Colorado River supplies for Arizona, for central Arizona, and certainly greater uncertainty. And so our focus is to get the state of Arizona on board with the DCP. Let me refresh your recollection that many of you know that by Arizona law, the state legislature must pass a concurrent resolution authorizing Tom Bishotsky, the head of Arizona Department of Water Resources, to sign the multi-state agreement, the agreement with California, Nevada, and Reclamation. That legislation is anticipated to be introduced in 2019. And the focus right now of what's called the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Steering Committee, the steering committee that ADWR and CAP have co-convened, is to develop a plan within Arizona, intra-Arizona agreements and possible companion legislation if needed, which would allow for the political support necessary to get the DCP concurrent resolution passed in 2019. That is the focus of the discussion. Next slide. The Drought Contingency Plan Agreement, as Ted referenced, has been a conversation that's been going on for a few years. The focus of the Lower Basin DCP agreement is to reduce the risk of Lake Mead falling below elevation 1025 before 2026 to acceptable levels. You see here on this slide that if you compare what we were looking at in 2007, when the 2007 guidelines were established, and you look at recent hydrology and current projections, the risk of Lake Mead falling below 1025, if you use the stress test hydrology, is 6 times higher from a percentage standpoint than it was in 2007. So the goal of the DCP agreement is to reduce the probability of reaching those critically low levels that could cause drastic reductions in water deliveries in Arizona and in other parts of the lower basin. Next slide. So one more graph. This slide shows the comparison between not having a drought contingency plan agreement in place and having it in place. And I would really turn your attention to the right side of this, right-hand side of the slide, using the stress test hydrology of 1988 to 2015. And you see that there is some benefit to passing a DCP with the blue line of reducing the risk of a tier 1 shortage to 1075 or below. There's some reduction in that risk. Next slide. And this slide shows the comparison of having a drought contingency plan agreement, of doing conservation at higher elevations of Lake Mead and in greater volumes of water. It shows the benefit of a DCP agreement for reducing the risk of falling below elevation 1020. And you see a substantial reduction with the DCP on the blue line on the slide on the right compared to not having a DCP. So I'd ask you to think about this. Sometimes these charts and sometimes water management can get rather wonky, but as we're talking to state legislators and talking to business leaders around the state as part of our campaign, this slide to us really poses the question, if you knew that without doing something more right now, if you knew that there was almost a 50% chance that the federal government was going to impose a shortage, think of it as a homeowner. If you knew that you were getting to a 50% chance of a major problem with your house, what would you be doing from a risk reduction or risk management standpoint? What would you be willing to do? And that's really the practical question that Arizonans are faced with right now. And the issue, frankly, is far too important just to be left to one agency or one particular water expert. It's a conversation that is involving an increasing number of Arizonans, as it should. Next slide. Ted, I think you were going to dig into this one a little bit. Is that right?
That's right, Kevin. So, as Kevin was describing, the state's water stakeholders have been engaged for a number of months trying to craft Arizona's approach to implementing the drought contingency plan. Importantly, the 2007 interim guidelines already include shortages or reductions in water available to Arizona and Nevada, and you can see that under the current AZ 07 in orange and Nevada's 07 amounts. Those amounts are reductions to Arizona and Nevada, and then there's also some agreed to reductions, voluntary reductions by Mexico as well under Minute 319 and as recently readopted under Minute 323. And those amounts are approximately 400,000 acre feet shared among those entities if we hit elevation 1075, 500,000 acre feet if we hit elevation 1050, and 600,000 acre feet if we hit elevation 1025. And those are sort of rough numbers, but and the drought contingency plan conversations that have started in Arizona, but have been going on among the basin states ever since that sort of 2012, 2013 difficult hydrology that we described a little while ago. The states are saying, well, maybe those aren't large enough to reductions, and maybe we are not taking reductions early enough to really keep Lake Mead from dropping to those very low critical levels where we can't even meet our or the Bureau of Reclamation's water delivery obligations to California and Arizona because it's drops too low below the outfalls of Lake Mead. And so these this chart and these numbers demonstrate that Arizona would actually, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and also Mexico and California, under this DCP construct, would take deeper cuts earlier and deeper cuts later as well to really just keep Lake Mead above those critical elevations of 1025 and keep it from dropping below down to elevation 1000 at all costs, just about. And there's a couple of important things to point out in this chart, which is under the law of the river, which is a construct of federal laws and regulations and treaties and state laws, California, by operation of that law, is not required to take any shortage all the way down to elevation 1000. They basically, under the 07 guidelines and under the 1968 Act, basically California got the first priority. So they get their full 4.4 million acre feet, and that Arizona and Nevada have to be basically cut back before California would have to take one drop or 1 acre feet of reduction. And importantly, this drought contingency plan, California is agreeing to take reductions in deliveries at critical levels to really keep Lake Mead above those critical levels. And similarly, Mexico have presumptively agreed. They've included language within Minute 323 that says Mexico will take reductions if the lower basin states agree on a drought contingency plan that's, basically similar to the one that they have been discussing among the lower basin states for the last couple of years. And so you have California and Mexico that are basically willing to share the burdens of bad hydrology or a difficult drought if the states can come to an agreement. And importantly, Arizona is the only state that's required to get it passed through the legislature, and Kevin's going to talk about this in a minute. But and each state is going to have to deal with how they would meter out these reductions within their own state, and that's where we're having these conversations here with Arizona. And maybe I'll pass that baton back over to Kevin to talk a little bit more in depth about that steering committee work.
Very good. Let's go to the next slide. So as Ted mentioned, there's an awful lot going on with the Water for Arizona Coalition and a whole range of other stakeholders discussing the issues that Ted has teed up. It is about how Arizona could come up with a plan for metering out reductions in Colorado River supplies under a drought contingency plan agreement. And from our campaign standpoint, from our coalition standpoint, to do that in a way that makes the system more flexible and resilient. And certainly be on guard that we don't go backwards from a state water policy and management standpoint, that we protect, for example, the 1980 Groundwater Code and its important provisions. Next slide. I mentioned the Arizona DCP Steering Committee. This is a group of roughly 40 stakeholders that have been convened by ADWR and CAP. And the charter is clear, and it's focused fairly narrowly on what it would take to adopt and implement the lower basin DCP in a way that is acceptable to Arizona water users. This is a stakeholder group that started meeting on August 9th. The Walton Family Foundation is a designated organization. Ted serves on the steering committee, and I serve as his alternate. And you see in this paragraph on this slide a reference to a really robust, complex, and ongoing discussion process among these stakeholders. And I would say, by way of commentary, that this is really engaging a broader sector of the economy, the business community, and various sectors of Arizona in water issues at a level we haven't seen in many years. Next slide. The steering committee has identified 4 main issues. It has been noted that the focus of the steering committee is not to address or solve every water policy or environmental agenda item or opportunity that we have in this state. The focus is on 4 interrelated issues. I'm going to briefly describe them. The first is what's called CAP agricultural mitigation. What this is about is irrigation districts have benefited from CAP water, as many of you know, in what's called the agricultural settlement pool. That water would be among the first that would be reduced, and so the irrigation districts, about 80% of the water in this category of CAP agriculture is in Pinal County, and these districts are raising the question: is there access to any alternate supplies under a DCP shortage, and on what terms? The second issue is tribal intentionally created surplus. Intentionally created surplus is a program authorized under the 2007 guidelines. And what this issue is about is including Arizona tribes in the opportunity for them to voluntarily choose to store part of their Colorado River entitlements in Lake Mead in a storage account that's called Tribal ICS, and figuring out how that conservation can be part of an integrated statewide plan and confirm tribal rights to do that voluntary storage. The third issue is called CAP excess water. Now, I think as many of you know, the Central Arizona Project, under its contract with the Secretary of the Interior, has a contract right to divert up to 2.8 million acre feet, Arizona's allotment under the compact, to the extent that other higher priority water users do not take the water. So until the last few years, there has been a quantity of water called excess water, which CAP has used either for underground storage, for the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District to enable new development, or at times also to remarket to other water users in Central Arizona. So the question raised here is, if we need to be doing extraordinary conservation in the new water reality, if we need to be creating system conservation, if we need to be focused on keeping the lake from falling to those critically low levels, should there be a new protocol and set of rules if water ever becomes available in a particular year that we've been historically treated as excess water? And you can imagine that's a very important issue in terms of how much conservation we achieve from plans going forward. The fourth is really a process issue. It's what the Arizona Department of Water Resources calls the Arizona Conservation Plan. It's really about how do Arizona water stakeholders, under the leadership of ADWR and CAP, how do we plan annually and over a period of years for conservation volumes that bolster Lake Mead levels and help avert those critically low levels? Who can participate? How we might pay for conservation to the extent funds are needed for voluntary conserved consumptive use. So this one's a lot about process, but it's also about having a plan in place for Arizona to live in the new water reality, which means planning for less deliveries and diversions from the Colorado River for Central Arizona. Next slide.
Great, Kevin. And I was just going to describe this slide to help folks understand that there have been actions and activities that have already been taking place. And you can see the blue sort of band is U.S. ICS, or intentionally created surplus. And it's a construct under the 2007 interim guidelines that allows an individual state or water user to, in the lower basin, reduce its uses of water to which it's legally entitled in 1 year and bank it in Lake Mead for taking out in a subsequent year under rules that are laid out in the 2007 interim guidelines explicitly. And that ICS mechanism has been very effective over the last decade. Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, or MET as we refer to it, had banked hundreds of thousands of acre feet, and when they were hitting a really critically dry period in California in the drought, on the northern part of the system, they draw water both from up by San Francisco and that northern part of the system, and they also draw water from the Colorado River Basin. But the northern system was under very difficult dry hydrology where they were basically getting zero water from that part of the system. They were able to take back some of the water that they had banked in Mead under the intentionally created surplus criteria. So this demonstrates that as that blue band is one sort of mechanism that we have available. Mexico is that yellow band where we, for the first time in 2012, agreed that Mexico, even though they only had an annual right to water in each and every year, we developed a mechanism whereby they could store voluntarily water in our reservoirs and take them when they needed them at a different time. And that's sort of, yellow band represents that. There's also some other voluntary contributions, which I won't describe at length, but there's also this more recent program that we've developed called the System Conservation Program, which is that sort of lighter red that's on the very top. And we have supported that, as have a number of water utilities and the Bureau of Reclamation, whereby there was a fund developed and people were voluntarily agreed to sign up and reduce their uses and be paid for that in a temporary, voluntary, compensated manner. And that is a new tool, and importantly, that water is just for the benefit of the system. It's not for the benefit of any one individual state or any individual one water user like ICS, the tool that I described just a little while ago. We have supported that through EDF more recently, and we are involved in some system conservation projects this year in 2018, and we expect to be supportive of that program should it continue in 2019 in the Lower Basin. And next slide. And here I think I was planning to turn it back over to you, Haley, to describe how Audubon's involved in all of these efforts, and then hopefully we can get to some of the comments that I've been seeing come in, and if there's additional ones that come in, we're happy to try to get to those as well.
Hey, Haley, if I may, this is Kevin. I want to just make one closing comment and then turn it over to you, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
You know, I think it bears mentioning that getting the DCP agreement in place and having conservation plans to leave less water in Lake Mead, take less from the river, we view this as Water for Arizona Coalition as the next big step, but it's only a step. We're also looking to build power and credibility and have linkages to other groups of all kinds, whether they're organized associations and trade groups, local environmental organizations, and beyond. We want to build power and a constituency for sustainable water management that addresses a whole range of issues into the future. This is the next big step, but we're also building power to affect other issues that I know folks care about on the call. So with that, Haley, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And that's a great wrap up. And with this slide, I just wanted to point out, we really want, our community of the RAN network to know that these issues do connect to rivers, right? They connect to habitat, they connect to rivers. Sometimes it's hard to see with wonky, big law of the river policy, but these things are important, and we've been writing blogs and trying to communicate that. So that's all I wanted to emphasize, is that if we can have the DCP in place, it's a plan that is known, and we can kind of plan for a drier water future, as we've kind of been talking about. So that was what I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve with just how you guys can stay connected with us and share with your friends about the network.
Sure. Thanks, Haley. Yeah, it can be hard to see how these things tie back, but our big concern, as you can read here, is that if water users start to see big cuts beyond what we're seeing in DCP when we hit those more critical levels, then they're likely to start looking for water elsewhere. One of the places that they have historically turned is groundwater. Fortunately, we have some forward-thinking laws in the state, the Groundwater Management Act being a big one, that protect those resources, which in turn protects our rivers, protects our birds, protects our other wildlife and the places we care about. So we don't see the DCP as the be and all of the water discussion, but it's a really critical step so we don't start seeing a lot of backsliding and a lot of on-the-ground impacts in the places we care about. So as it moves forward, we are going to be calling on the RAN network for support if they need support for legislation. We'll be calling on you to protect our existing laws if we see attacks on things like the Groundwater Management Act. So you can learn more about that at the link there. That'll link you to one of Haley's blogs, and you can join the network at that bit.ly link just below it. That'll be our way to get a hold of you when your voice, your time, your physical presence, whatever it may be, can be of value. There's also some other links at the bottom down there. We have the Department of Water Resources, DCP landing page, kind of another one from CAP, the other big voice in that discussion, as well as the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So check all those out and definitely join up for the Western Rivers Action Network so we can keep you posted when we need you.
Great. Well, maybe this is a good time to address some of the questions that have come in, and happy to give you my 2 cents, and maybe we'll, seek your input as well, Kevin, sort of on a question by question statement. There was one question that was raised more recently just about minute 319 and minute 323 that does include a provision for environmental values or attributes to be included or protected within Mexico under that agreement. And some of you may recall the historic pulse flow that occurred in 2014, where we reconnected the Colorado River to the sea for the first time in decades. And minute 323, which was adopted last September, continues those environmental or sort of restoration goals with commitments by both the U.S. and Mexican federal governments, as well as philanthropic organizations, to continue to restore areas or parts of the Colorado River within Mexico. And it really gives a little bit of hope that we can do that more broadly within the United States as well. Kevin, do you want to say anything about that one? And then we can take some additional, go through these additional comments that I've been seeing coming through.
No, I think that covers that one, and we can go to the others.
Great. So I'm working sort of backwards up the line. There was a question about the levels of 1075, 1050, and 1025. And as I indicated in that one slide, there was, Mexico and Nevada and Arizona have commitments and basically on the order of 400, 500, and 600,000 acre feet of reduced deliveries under the 2007 guidelines and the current minutes. But importantly, the DCP nearly doubles those amounts, where they're up to actually 1.3 million acre feet of reductions between California, Mexico, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Nevada, and Arizona, if we were to drop to those most critical levels of 1025. Importantly, they take reductions sooner and deeper earlier on, and with the idea that they hopefully won't drop down to that critical level. But anything you want to say about that one, Kevin?
No, I think that that covers it well. I think as a coalition, we certainly will be have been, and will continue to make that point with state legislators and business leaders and others about how California, Mexico, Nevada are all signing up for additional reductions under the DCP. Those are important points to make in getting the concurrent resolution done in the legislature, and I think that's certainly part of our efforts. I might just, Ted, if it makes sense to you, I might just transition to Carrie Meister's question about surplus and CAP diverting it for other uses. Carrie, it's a really good question, and that issue is definitely part of discussions about so-called CAP excess water. One of the things that our group has been saying is that we ought to drop that language. Like Ted pointing out that we probably ought not to be talking about drought. We ought to be talking about the new normal and aridification. In the same way, when it comes to Arizona diversions from the Colorado River, I think the notion of excess water, that idea has come and gone. So to your really good question, Carrie, the question is, if CAP's contract rights might allow it to divert a certain quantity, which in past years would be under the bucket of excess water, how will it be treated given the new reality and given the pressures of and the need to do conservation under the DCP? That's an issue that the steering committee is taking up, and from a coalition standpoint, we certainly believe that conservation volumes for the system, for the health of the river system, need to be given top priority.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I see another question a little bit further up about rivers and also lawns in Arizona, and I will sort of take those in tandem and then maybe get your 2 cents on those as well, Kevin. Which, with regard to rivers, it is this is not, the steering committee is not to address each and every water problem facing the state of Arizona, and I for one, believe that Arizona has a long way to go to be able to adequately protect rivers within their state. I live in Colorado, and I'm very familiar with the in-stream flow program that has existed there for decades. And basically, the state of Colorado and many other Western states allow for protection of in-stream flows and for the recreational environmental values they protect. And I absolutely believe that Arizona can improve with regard to that policy. I don't know that the steering committee is the best way or place to deal with that, but I do think it's important to lay down that marker in the context of our longer term goals, and use that platform to advocate for improvements on policy related to in-stream flow values. And because this is such a time-constrained sort of steering committee with a very specific focus, I think it would be highly unlikely that we would be able to effectively get that policy advanced in the steering committee. But I think at the very least, if we can raise that mantle for further discussion at future legislative sessions or additional statewide bodies to see the value of that and improving those policies, I would support that completely. And on the lawns, absolutely, other states have moved there quickly, and that's both Nevada and California. In the throes of their drought, they went immediately to buying up turf at $2 or $3 a square foot, and I think it's a very valuable tool that Arizona should be giving a little bit more look at. But Kevin, maybe do you want to say anything about either of those two comments before we get on to some of the others?
Yes, I would say very briefly as it relates to turf elimination and turf buyback, I think it is part of what we need to be doing in Arizona. When you look at the big picture, the volume of water conserved is smaller than some other opportunities for efficiencies and conservation, but it's still but it remains, I think, very important as an opportunity as part of raising public awareness and public consciousness around the new water reality and how we need to adapt. How do we need to adapt as a state, as a community, starting with how it's reflected in sort of core water management, but really beyond that in society. That's the challenge we face, is one of adaptation. And so dealing with turf in residences is part of what we need to be talking about in the very near future.
So I noticed a couple of additional comments have come in. There's one about the working groups that are not being conducted in the public, and why can't the working group meetings be open and transparent? And what I would say is, I think, while it's not ideal, it's not always easy to have these very complicated and complex discussions occur in a room with 40 people sitting around the big table with the public there, interjecting. I think it can just lead to sort of a little bit more posturing and positioning, as opposed to actually rolling up your sleeves and getting into the dirty, nitty-gritty, technical, wonky types of conversations that I think have to occur in the context of the working groups. But, I certainly don't think that it's anything nefarious is going on with regard to setting up of those working groups. It's just rather that it's, just almost a sense of practicality more than anything. But I think, to the extent that we can talk to you about what's happening in the working groups that we're participating in, I think we can certainly arrange for individual conversations, either at chance or prearranged, or at the sort of steering committee meetings. We can try to connect up with you to make sure that you're aware of sort of where those working groups are headed and why, and sort of what our positions have been in the context of those working groups. But I don't know, Kevin, do you want to say anything more about that comment?
Nothing really more. It is a tension between being able to get people to share things that they might be willing to agree to, one step before it being part of the full steering committee public process. It's what I would say is, as Ted mentioned, we'll share what we can on in the ongoing process through the normal communication channels. We'll certainly share what we can on the working groups we're involved in. Maybe I could just transition, Ted, and mention Gary Beverly's comment about the Groundwater Management Act and the fact that 87% of the state's geography, roughly, is not covered by any groundwater management to speak of. Really good point. And I think I would mention that Water for Arizona Coalition, during this past legislative session, we were active in opposing proposals to undermine groundwater management and processes that are part of protecting the San Pedro River. We also had our messaging and our advocacy also raised this issue, the fact that in most of the geography of Arizona, we don't even know how much groundwater is being withdrawn with any great assurance. And I would say, both as it relates to groundwater pumping that affects the Verde River, the San Pedro River, and other groundwater-fed important areas. In addition to that, we have a number of basins where groundwater overdraft is becoming a very urgent issue for local communities. And so at this point, what we're trying to do is keep that issue on the agenda, although I think that is another issue where, in terms of the current steering committee process, we want to make sure we don't make the problem worse, but that we lay the groundwork for addressing the absence of groundwater management in the future.
Great. Well, I noticed there's 2 additional comments, and I think we're starting to lose some folks. We're at the top of the hour, but real quickly, there was a question that I didn't quite understand about the steps, what 5 steps that will be recommended once the lower levels are reached. I think that there's the way that chart laid out, there will be additional reductions that are contemplated that Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation would each take. And it's up to those individual states, or in the case Mexico, the country of Mexico, as to how to divvy up those reductions in uses. And so that's really what the steering committee is having conversations about, is how they would accept, rather than 300, 400, and 500, or sorry, 400, 500, and 600,000. Arizona's portion of that is the largest portion, and it's almost nearly double of that. That's what these steering committee conversations are about. And then there's a question about Cochise County and the dairy moving in there, and I'm not sure that I can answer that question. Maybe Kevin, if you have an answer for that, go ahead.
I don't know about the specifics of that particular operation, but clearly the issue of the absence of meaningful groundwater management in greater Arizona is an issue, I believe, whose time is coming. It's already here. Just ask the homeowners and residents on wells in a number of basins in Arizona who are seeing the well levels drop precipitously from new pumping. And so, I think part of what we've realized as a community, as a table of folks concerned about the environment and sustainable water policy, part of what we've recognized is, Arizona is a very property rights state, very independent-minded. In many areas of the state, very anti-regulation. But by golly, my homestead, my property right may not mean very much if the well is running dry. And so what we're looking to do is to start to think about how, as a community, we can build a constituency for rational management with locally tailored groundwater management solutions. We believe we have to work locally and dig in locally, and it has to come from the ground up. We don't think, for what it's worth, this is just Kevin's assessment, but I don't think it's likely that in the next 1 to 3 years we'll have state legislation to comprehensively deal with that issue. But there are needs of the community that are unmet, They need more tools. They need resources. They need the state to bring attention to the impact on communities and their economic future. So I believe there's opportunities for us to be part of that in a productive way.
Great. Well, I think we should probably close. I do see one more comment about where development comes in, and what I would suggest is that, you know, what I've seen across the West is not that development or additional economic development is an opposite for reducing water usage, but rather, and you don't have to look any further than Las Vegas, where they were adding 6,000 to 8,000 people to their city or their area a month, and they were reducing their uses at the exact same time with very, you know, creative and sort of innovative water conservation techniques. And so there has been this decoupling of water use with additional people and additional development. And, you know, I think it's going to take that kind of activity, and I think you can see it's not whether Phoenix and Arizona continue to grow, it's how they grow that will be determinative of how they can do so in a way that sustainably manages and uses the Colorado River allocations. So with that, I also want to thank the Audubon, National Audubon Society for putting on this event. And thank you, Kevin, for co-leading this webinar with me. And I really appreciate everyone's attention and interest in this topic, and happy to hopefully continue the conversation going forward. Kevin?
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much to Audubon and the RAN network and activists. You're really important to the current work and also what we hope to build together on sustainable water going forward. And I also just wanted to give a shout out to our colleagues, Tanya Trio, and especially Amy McCoy, for helping us frame up a presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. This was a great conversation, and you will receive some follow-up materials from this webinar, and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.